Okay, and al-Khannas is a title, something that only occurs in Surah An-Nas. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is naming or giving a laqab, giving a nickname to Shaitan, to Iblis himself. And as we said, that the meaning of this word, sort of indicating one who hides away or slinks away or causes the mischief and then runs, it indicates to us the method and mechanism by which the Shaitan leads us astray. We talk about bad habits, and some of the bad habits that we have might be sinful habits. And why do these sinful habits keep on coming to us? Because the Shaitan, by whispering, by being someone who basically does it and then leaves, he basically just points out to us. He makes us notice the possibility of committing a sin and notice a justification for why it might not be that big of a deal, right? He shows us the cues, and then he whispers to you the justification that it might not be that bad if you do it. You have a reason. Everything has a maslaha, right? There's always a maslaha, a reason to do it. We can always justify. I'm just doing dawah, right? I'm just, I'm doing what everybody else is doing, right? It's not like I'm doing this. That would be way worse. There's always a justification. The Shaitan is ready to give you that justification, and then he'll retreat and watch from a distance as everything blows up in your face. And so it becomes really important to link it up with what we're about to talk about in Atomic Habits when it comes to how to minimize our bad habits and how to disrupt them and how to break them, and admitting that some of our bad habits are also sinful habits. We've been going through the book Atomic Habits by James Clear, a very, very useful book for Muslims. Coincides almost one-to-one with some of the things that we have to do in Islam, and it really helps us with maximizing our good habits and minimizing our bad habits. The title of the next chapter is The Secret to Self-Control, and he brings up some wild statistics. Okay, so he talks about drug addiction. He brings up a case study of the Vietnam War, and when American soldiers were abroad in Vietnam fighting the unjust war there, that a whopping 35% of U.S. servicemen tried heroin while they were there. That's crazy. And of those people who were there, 20% of the soldiers were addicted to heroin. 20%. That's 1 out of every 5 soldiers in the U.S. military fighting in Vietnam was addicted to heroin. That's mind-blowing. Now, even more mind-blowing that, what percent of them used heroin within 1 year of returning to the United States? Only 5% of those people who were basically addicted, they were heroin addicts. Over in Vietnam, when they came back, only 5% used heroin within the first year of being back. That's nuts. Why is it nuts? It challenges a lot of our assumptions about addiction and addictive behavior and how they work. In our culture, in the United States of America, we definitely tend to see addiction and drug use as a moral failing, and it is a moral failing. Like, let's not be unclear about that. However, what this study showed is that there's a lot more going on than just willpower, okay? It shows you the power of context, the power of environment, and the power of cues. Now, let's flip these sorts of things, okay? Imagine, what are the numbers, do you think, of people who get addicted to heroin in their own homes, right? In their own homeland, where they live, in their residence. What percentage of people who go through these programs relapse within a year? 90% of them are using heroin again within a year. The people who are abroad in a totally different environment were addicted to heroin. They come back, change everything about their lives. Only 5% used heroin within 1 year. Think about it. That's the point that the author is making when it comes to the secret to self-control. The point is that unhealthy behavior, yes, there is a dimension to it that is about self-control. There's a dimension to it about moral weakness. There's a dimension to it that is moral choice. Okay? However, there is another dimension to it that has to do with a disciplined environment. Okay? So he talks about the difference between a disciplined person. We are used to thinking about things in terms of disciplined people, that there are disciplined people and undisciplined people, and disciplined people just have all the willpower in the world, right? And they can just face any temptation, and they're successful at resisting that temptation, versus this idea that really successful people create disciplined environments for themselves. They create environments where there is no temptation or where there's very, very, very little temptation. So they don't have the chance to have a failure of willpower. Basically, he says that the people who seem that you and I look at as the most disciplined are the people who spend the least amount of time around temptation and triggers and cues that would lead to negative behaviors. The first thing that came to mind was the hadith of the person, that killed 99 men. Okay, so he was a person who had murdered 99 people. He went to a monk. He asked, will God forgive me? And the monk said, no way. And so he killed the monk and he made it an even 100. And then he went to a sheikh and he said, I killed 100 guys. I killed 100 people. Can I be forgiven? Will Allah forgive me? He said, yes, but you have to change your location. You got to get out of your situation where you're at and you need to go. And you know the rest of the hadith. He died on the way, but Allah made it so that because of his intention and his effort that he expended, Allah forgave him, even though he didn't even make it to the place where he was at. So this is exactly what the author is talking about. That Islam recognizes that we want to not just build disciplined people, we also want to build disciplined environments. And sometimes the key to building a disciplined person is actually to build a disciplined environment. That the person who is the most successful is the person who spends the least amount of time around temptation, which is also borne out in other sort of ayat and examples in our tradition. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in Surah Al-Isra, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Don't even come close to illicit sexual intercourse. Don't even get close to it. Because if you get close to it, there's a likelihood that you're going to fall into it. And so you need a tuqah, right? You need this sort of, taqwa literally means sort of like a wiqaya is like a protective barrier. You need to put enough of a barrier in between yourself and that haram thing that you're not going to get in a tempting situation. Other examples, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ talking about doubtful matters, right? The halal is clear and the haram is clear. And in between them are mushtabihat, the things that are doubtful. And then he says that the example of a believer is like somebody who's grazing their flock around the hima. The hima is like the pastures, right? The king's pastures. If you graze your flock on the edge of that pasture, it's just a matter of time before one gets in. And then you're guilty of doing something haram. That somebody who has taqwa, wiqaya, is going to put a barrier in between themselves and the haram. They're not going to be in a tempting situation. They're not going to put themselves into temptation so that they will fail. Anybody can break a habit, but it's much harder to forget a habit. That habit lives on in your mind, and this is what the shaitan plays with his whisperings, right? And so the key to stopping bad habits is to make them invisible. Just like the key to good habits is to make them visible and increase visibility, the key to breaking bad habits, and especially sinful habits, is to make them invisible. Reduce your exposure, remove cues, and make sure that you spend the least amount of time in temptation as possible.